Recently, I came across a post titled, "Were there transgender people in the Middle Ages?" on Reddit. The fourth sentence began with, "There is a mountain of evidence." This immediately caught my attention, as I had no real prior knowledge of medieval transgender history and was genuinely curious to learn more. However, as I continued reading, I realized that the article took a long time to get to the point. Only halfway through did the author finally present an actual case from the Middle Ages. Up until then, the article was mostly filled with modern interpretations being retrofitted to medieval times. In total, the author mentions just 3 examples, including Joan of Arc. To me, this didn't seem to constitute a mountain of evidence. This motivated me to explore the topic more deeply. Research on transgender history in the Middle Ages is certainly active, but unfortunately, the quality of much of it is lacking. For instance, one article that claims to confirm the existence of transgender people in medieval times exclusively cites sources from the 20th century. Over and over, modern concepts are projected onto the Middle Ages, with researchers searching for historical phenomena that might loosely fit today's definitions. But history doesn't work that way. To illustrate this, I'll use an admittedly exaggerated analogy. Today, we measure car engine performance in horsepower, but the existence of horses in the Middle Ages doesn't imply that cars existed back then. Similarly, just because a man wore dresses, it doesn't necessarily mean he would be considered a trans woman by modern standards. The first thing we need is a clear understanding of what being transgender actually means. To avoid any suspicion of bias, I'll use the following definition from the German portal Gendertreff, which I translated. Gendertreff means as much as gender meeting point. Trans identity describes a natural phenomenon in which gender identity does not match the sex assigned at birth. Under the term transgender or trans, the terms are sometimes fluid. For example, a transgender person may have started cross-dressing because they did not yet know what was or was wrong with them. Trans people refer to individuals whose external sexual characteristics, and thus the sex assigned at birth, do not completely or not always correspond to their perceived gender, the so-called identity gender. Thus, trans men are people who were assigned the female gender at birth, and trans women are people who were assigned the male gender at birth. Casually, one might say, the packaging, the body, was wrong at birth. However, the experiences of trans people cannot be reduced to this simple formula, as the topic extends to many other aspects of life beyond the physical. Moreover, many trans people reject the notion of labeling their bodies as wrong just because they are trans. The experiences are diverse and difficult to standardize. This definition captures the complexity of the topic. I'd like to highlight a few key points for further consideration. 1. Trans identity is a natural phenomenon. I do not dispute this. As a cisgender man, I can't claim to understand how trans people feel, but I accept their experiences at face value. I am also firmly convinced that everyone has the right to live in a way that makes them happy, and gender identity is undoubtedly central to that. Nonetheless, I will argue that transgender people, as we define them today, did not exist in the Middle Ages. If anyone was hoping this would be a thinly veiled argument for transphobia, you can stop watching now. I find it sad that we live in a time when scientific arguments are reflexively seen as political statements requiring disclaimers. But so be it. 2. Discovering one's trans identity is a process that often begins with confusion, which is eventually overcome. 3. The body is central, but not the only factor. Trans identity also extends to other areas of life. From this definition, I derive 3 points. 1. Transgender involves a consistent voluntary change in gender identity that is permanent rather than temporary. 2. Trans people seek guidance to understand their experiences, often through community, literature, or media. 3. It is a process that touches all aspects of life, not just clothing or outward appearance, but also legal equality and social acceptance. The problem with applying these conclusions to the Middle Ages is that none of these elements existed in any substantial form back then. While trans people may have found private support, they lacked the resources available today. This includes medical resources like hormone therapies and surgeries, which for obvious reasons did not exist in the Middle Ages. Additionally, modern trans people have access to the experiences of others with just a few clicks. According to the article, 0.6% of the population today identifies as trans, and they can easily connect online. In the Middle Ages, these individuals would have been largely isolated. To discuss transgender individuals in the Middle Ages, we first need to address some theoretical questions within historical sciences. The framework conditions were entirely different during that time, making it impossible to draw direct parallels. There was no widespread recognition that gender identity assigned at birth could be incorrect or changeable. Thus, we are searching for clues about people who may be considered precursors to today's transgender community, while avoiding the imposition of modern political and legal ideas onto the medieval context. For example, I show a methodological approach from literature that starts out well, but declines significantly as it progresses. Theoretically, history deals with 5 types of topics. 1. Completed events. For instance, the First Crusade is an event that definitively ended. 2. Ongoing issues. The Catholic Church, for example, still exists today. 3. Partially finished, partially continuing issues. England and France existed in the Middle Ages, but their forms of government have since evolved. 4. Revived concepts with new meanings. A good example is the word democracy, which has been reinterpreted over time. 5. Mixed topics. Kingship is an example, as it existed in the Middle Ages, but later evolved into forms like absolutism or constitutional monarchy. At first glance, the concept of transgender does not fit into any of these categories for reasons already explained. It is a modern concept unknown in the Middle Ages. And before anyone protests, we do have in-depth theoretical and scientific research available on questions of gender identity today. I'll show an example. These works have significantly influenced our understanding of transgender issues. Incidentally, this also applies to those who dismiss gender studies as unscientific or a waste of time and money. By engaging with the research even critically, one acknowledges the existence of such works and in doing so, forms an opinion, positive or negative. None of this was present in the Middle Ages. The Church recognized that some individuals desired to live with a gender identity different from their biological sex, but it rejected this notion. Over time, the treatment of such individuals became stricter. One key figure often cited as evidence for the existence of transgender people in the Middle Ages is Marina the monk. In the 5th century, Marina disguised herself as a man to enter a monastery with her father. Her biological sex was only discovered after her death, and she spent her entire life concealing it. However, Marina's actions were not driven by a desire to live as a man. Rather, she sought to devote her life to God. Marina's father originally intended to enter the monastery alone and to arrange a marriage for her. Marina objected, asking why he would save his own soul but destroy hers. This reference to the soul shows that her motivation was religious. The gender change, as the sources suggest, was a means to an end. Some might argue that she was simply masking her desire to live as a man, but this cannot be substantiated by the available evidence. To work with the concept of transgender in a medieval context, we must make an important initial concession. We are operating under the assumption that precursors of today's transgender people existed, but were not fully aware of their situation due to the lack of necessary social and legal developments. This means we are dealing with a topic that is not fully resolved. Analytically, this leads to two key points. First, we must search for examples of behaviors that we might associate with transgender identity today. Second, we must also consider whether there could be alternative explanations for such behaviors. For example, in English theatre, women were prohibited from performing on stage for a long time, so men played female roles. The fact that men wore women's clothing and temporarily assumed female identities was not an expression of transgender identity, but rather a legal necessity. Could trans women have taken advantage of this situation? It's plausible, but not provable. What we can clearly identify is the legal requirement for men to dress as women in these circumstances. This second analytical point is often overlooked, leading to publications that are, frankly, absurd. Take, for example, the mention of Jesus Christ. A line from the image on the screen reads, translated from German, "But have you ever seen an image of the Savior on the cross and thought of a vagina when you saw his bleeding side wound?" To answer for myself, no. The image below, presumably meant to reinforce this point, only confused me further. My first thought when seeing it was, that looks like Sauron. And now, unfortunately, I'll never be able to watch Lord of the Rings without wondering if Sauron is a vagina. The so-called proof that the stab wound represents a vagina comes from an 11-minute YouTube video. And since this YouTube video is significantly longer than 11 minutes, I'll go ahead and claim that I know better. Now let's turn to Joan of Arc. She wore men's clothing, one of the charges brought against her during her trial. What is often overlooked in interpretations that try to cast Joan as a non-binary figure is that she may have worn men's clothing for entirely practical reasons. Armor is much more functional near a battlefield. Let's refer to Joan's own words from the interrogation transcripts in a modern English translation. "Who counseled you to take a man's dress?" To this, she repeatedly refused to answer. Eventually she said, "With that, I charge no one." Her responses to this question varied, but at one point she said, "Robert de Baudricourt made those who went with me swear to conduct me well and safely. Go, said Robert de Baudricourt to me, go, and let come what may. I know well that God loves the Duc d'Orléans. I have had more revelations about the Duc d'Orléans than about any man alive, except my king. It was necessary for me to change my woman's garments for a man's dress. My counsel thereon said well." Despite this, she frequently referred to herself as a maid. For instance, in her 5th public interrogation, one of her letters was read. It included this excerpt. "Count d'Armagnac, my very good and dear friend, I, Jean, the maid, acquaint you that your message has come before me, which tells me that you have sent at once to know from me which of the 3 popes mentioned in your memorial you should believe." At the end of her 3rd interrogation, we also find this exchange. "Would you like to have a woman's dress? Give me one, and I will take it and be gone. Otherwise, no. I am content with what I have, since it pleases God that I wear it." In my view, these statements indicate that Joan saw herself as a maid and judged her clothing based on practicality. I find it difficult to disregard her self-identification as the maid, simply because she wore men's clothes. However, in the interest of transparency, let's examine an excerpt from one of the texts that suggests otherwise. While I believe this interpretation is incorrect, it deserves space for consideration. Joan regularly self-identifies as a maid, but Joan spoke very carefully during the trial. Joan's actions and carefully chosen words make it debatable whether Joan, if alive today, might identify as trans, or perhaps even non-binary. But that is complicated enough to be the subject of its own article. It is enough to say for now that Joan may not have had much liberty to speak candidly about gender and identity. The list of such far-fetched interpretations could go on. For instance, the depiction of eunuchs in Byzantine art with an angelic skin tone doesn't make them genderless figures. It simply indicates that they are eunuchs, missing the male part of their bodies. Similarly, the famed Viking grave in Finland, where a woman was buried with a sword, doesn't necessarily make her a trans Viking. She may simply have been a warrior. The presence of male grave goods could also have emotional or symbolic significance, rather than suggesting a transgender identity. However, there are genuine examples from the Middle Ages where we don't immediately encounter such source problems. I would like to present 3 of these cases. Hardly any account of transgender individuals in the Middle Ages can avoid mentioning this first case. A 14th century London court document describes the situation of a person engaged in the oldest profession in the world. On the 11th of December, in the 18th year of Richard II, John Britby of the county of York and John Rykene, calling herself Eleanor, were brought before John Fresh, mayor, and the aldermen of the City of London. They were found last Sunday night between the hours of 8 and 9 by certain city officials, lying by a stall in Soper's Lane, committing that detestable, unmentionable, and ignominious vice while dressed in women's clothing. The original text is in Latin, but I am working from a modern translation. From this, we learn that the person in question was originally known as John, but was now calling herself Eleanor. It has been suggested that John, or Eleanor, was later imprisoned by the Bishop of London after interrogation, and there is evidence to suggest that John Rykene may have escaped custody in 1399. From the protocol of the case, we can infer that John consciously adopted the identity of Eleanor. However, it is unclear whether this choice was connected to the profession of sex work. John, or Eleanor, testified that it was a woman named Elizabeth Bronderer who first encouraged this transformation, training John Eleanor in the trade. The protocol also reveals that John Eleanor repeatedly stole women's clothing from suitors, presumably to maintain a feminine appearance. I interpret this as John deliberately becoming Eleanor and embracing this new identity. However, there was still an acknowledgement that John Eleanor was not biologically a woman. For instance, Elizabeth initially presented her daughter Alice to potential clients and later swapped her with Eleanor under the cover of darkness, as it would have been obvious to the customers that Eleanor was not born female. The confusion surrounding gender identity is evident on both sides of the interrogation. Neither the authorities nor the individuals seemed entirely certain about what they were dealing with. The second case comes from a 13th century literary work by Dietrich von Glatz, set in what is now Germany. In the story, a noblewoman whose name is not revealed has an affair with a knight while married to a man named Conrad. The knight gives her gifts that were culturally associated with masculinity. When the affair is exposed, Conrad leaves his wife. In response, the woman cuts off her hair and takes on the identity of a knight, calling herself Heinrich. From that point onward, the poet refers to her as he. Heinrich goes on to achieve victories in tournaments. In verse 471, we encounter the following declaration: "I am a knight and not a woman." Heinrich then attempts to force Conrad, now jealous of his former wife's success, into an intimate relationship with him as a man. Conrad refuses, citing the sinful nature of such an act. Eventually, Heinrich reverts to identifying as a woman and expresses a desire to submit to her husband's will from that point forward. This story reveals two significant insights. First, it suggests that there was, at least in literature, an understanding that a person could potentially change their gender permanently. Second, it underscores the deep-seated belief that such behavior was considered sinful. Conrad, even knowing that Heinrich was biologically female, refused to resume the relationship until she was willing to become a woman again. The third case study focuses on a person named Rolandinus Ronchaia, who identified as Rolandina. In 1354, Rolandina was sentenced to death by burning in Venice. Like others, she was involved in the oldest profession in the world. Under torture, it was revealed that Rolandinus had initially been married to a woman, although the marriage was never consummated. After his wife died during the plague, he moved to Padua, where he was mistaken for a woman and adopted a female identity. Despite being aware of having male sexual characteristics, Rolandinus's appearance was so feminine that even when wearing trousers, he was still perceived as a woman. Over time, Rolandina, by then fully embracing her female identity, caught the attention of a man. To maintain the deception, she concealed her male anatomy during their intimate encounter. This marked the beginning of her career in sex work, a life she led for 7 years before being discovered. During interrogation, Rolandina justified her profession by stating that she could not achieve anything better. After enduring further torture, she was executed. What makes this case particularly interesting is the introduction of a new dimension: Rolandina's deception of the men she was involved with. Even the interrogators expressed skepticism, questioning whether the clients truly hadn't noticed the deception. In conclusion, the 3 case studies presented demonstrate that there were indeed individuals in the Middle Ages who voluntarily adopted a different gender identity. However, none of these cases suggest an awareness that the gender assigned at birth was inherently wrong. Instead, these individuals often found themselves transitioning into another gender identity by chance. Rolandinus was mistaken for a woman based on her appearance. Joan became Eleanor under the influence of Elizabeth, and Heinrich transformed after being abandoned by her husband. In all cases, there was significant confusion surrounding their situations, and in one instance, a return to the original gender occurred. This highlights how crucial the societal framework of the time was. The Middle Ages did not provide the space or understanding needed to develop a concept of transgender identity as we know it today. Many other supposed examples of transgender individuals from the medieval period can also be interpreted differently. I found a sentence in the literature particularly revealing. Trans people wish to find historical role models to help explain their identity. This is an understandable desire. However, it leads us back to the fact that history doesn't function in this way. History does not owe representation to every group at every moment. The conscious effort by transgender individuals to explore and explain their identity is a relatively modern development, emerging only after 1900, which is still older than many might assume. The Middle Ages, therefore, had no concept of transgender as we understand it. The period recognized isolated individuals who were viewed through the lens of the time as mad, heretical, criminal, or a combination of these. They themselves had no better explanation for their experiences. Our ability to reassess them through a modern lens is a privilege of contemporary developments. However, referencing the Middle Ages to politically instrumentalize it is not appropriate. This applies both to advancing the rights of transgender people and, conversely, to opposing them. The political debates of today, as I made clear at the outset, were simply not part of the discourse in the medieval period. Changing one's gender was considered wrong unless there were exceptional circumstances as seen in English theatre. The fact that individuals still pursued this did not alter that perception. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.